So in this video, we're going to go through the process of creating a manual invoice. So this is an invoice that is essentially created within the back office area as opposed to being linked with a placement, although you do have the option to link it to the placement, link it to a placement if you wish. In terms of access to the manual invoice option here, it's available off the sales invoices row. It's worth noting as well that these individual options within the back office area, they're not sort of segregated out as user group permissions like some of the other areas. Essentially, if you have the rights to the back office option of the navigation, you'll then have access to these points. But if we click into manual invoice, what you're then taken to is a form which allows you to basically go about creating the invoice header details. So you create the invoice header first, and then you save that, and then from once it's saved, you can then go through the process of creating invoice lines. So we start by referencing or specifying the owning company, as mentioned previously. The company is obviously the company associated with the invoice, so we'll look up, we'll find colleague. You can then look up the invoice contact that you're going to liaise with. So we'll find this one there as an example. What you can then do is reference your invoice address. So on selection of the company, the associated invoice addresses of that company will become available in this drop-down option. So you can pick an address within here. It's also worth noting that when we selected a company, that the account reference was automatically populated. So if there was an account reference that was stored against the company record, that would be brought through into here just to help with the kind of manual population of that. You then can specify a PO number if there is one. We'll just put anything there as an alphanumeric field. You have the invoice date and tax date if different to reference there. And here you have the option to link it to a requirement if you want. So you could just say save there and go about creating an invoice, kind of a separate segregated invoice to be sent to this company. Or if you wanted to specifically look up a placement, you could click to look up a placement, and then you'd be able to find any placements that are associated with the company based on search criteria that you'd entered here. And if you wanted to, you could reference a specific company, hit select, and then that company is then now referenced and associated with the invoice. But for the purposes of creating a manual invoice and making the point of it being a segregated element, we'll disassociate any association with placements and just keep it as a separate manual invoice component. So what we'll then do is hit save. And what you can see now is that we're now taken into the header details area. So here we can go about entering in the specific reason for the invoice. So if we enter, we'll say one-off induction fee for David Payne, say 2,000. And then on hitting tab, or if you just clicked away, you'll see that the net value has resulted in a tax off the back of the tax code. So obviously on the basis of a selected tax code, the associated rate that was referenced, which again we covered in previous videos when we were going through the lookups associated with back office, that then affects the associated tax linked with it. We have our nominal code, which you would specify here manually, and then you have our department code, which is it's the department code that's obviously relevant to Sage in terms of the Sage department code. So if we just put in here contract 1, say, as just an example department code, and then we then hit save there. And what you can see is that a line has been created, an invoice line has been created within the invoice record. So now you've got your invoice header details, but you've got your invoice line details there as well. And you can go back and forth as you need to, essentially until you're happy that you've got all the details associated with your invoice raised. You can then go to list invoices within here, and what that will do is it will show you within your list invoices area your manual invoice that you've created. So you can see here that you've got a type here of a manual invoice, and that's covered there with the details of the invoice. So that covers the creation of a manual invoice. So what we'll do now is go through the process of creating a manual credit. Ultimately, it's the same workflow as the manual invoice. but with obviously the difference in that it's essentially a credit note rather than an invoice that's being generated. So what we'll do is associate it to the same company. So if we do a lookup for colleague again, and we'll again do a lookup against the contact, and we'll select the same. Now it's the credit address rather than invoice address. You can reference a PO if you wish to credit back on the PO as part of the admin. You've got the credit date and obviously the tax date. It's associated there. The currency, the account reference was pulled through from the company as it is before, and obviously again you have the option to link to a placement. We'll just hit save there, and that obviously creates the credit line header. So you've got a header there now in terms of the main document for the invoice, and now what you do is obviously go about adding the credit line. So if we specify ultimately a refund on, sorry, I'd say it's a credit, isn't it? A credit on deduction fee for David Payne. And again, we use the same values here. And we're entering a department code again. There we go, and we hit save. And ultimately, what you see is that it's created the line, the credit line that's available there. And then what we do is ultimately, when we've gone back and forth and made sure that we're happy with our credit note, we hit go to list invoices, and what you're going to see is that there's a manual credit that's there now. So you've got a manual invoice which we generated, and now a manual credit that we generated within list invoices. So that covers the generate invoices, which obviously is generating off the back of placements, timesheets, charges, and the actual workflow within the system against placement records. Then it covers manual invoicing and manual crediting, which are obviously just generated within the back office area. What we'll do now is go into list invoices to cover that workflow.